We're live. So it's very good then to welcome our speaker for this morning, who is David Lindberg, who's the Hilldale Professor Emeritus of the History of Science at the University of Wisconsin. He holds also a degree in physics from Northwestern University and a PhD in history and philosophy of science from Indiana University. He's written or edited no less than 13 books, and he's now editing, along with Ron Numbers, who's been here in Cambridge several times recently, the forthcoming 8-volume Cambridge History of Science, of which 3 volumes have now been published, as I think, up until now. Professor Lindberg has written many books, but also received many awards for his books. I won't recount all those now, because I don't want to take his time. But I'd simply like to say that we're very delighted that he's come over especially to give these lectures, to participate in his course, and we look forward very much to his first lecture this morning, which is entitled The Medieval Church Encounters the Classical Tradition, St. Augustine and Roger Bacon. So over to you, David. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have been invited to participate, and it's always a pleasure to come back to Cambridge. Adding to the pleasure is the opportunity to talk about a subject that has occupied me for over the past 20 years, namely the relationship between science and religion in the Middle Ages. The medieval period has proved to be extraordinary fertile ground for myth-making, and among the many pleasures of working on medieval materials is the opportunity to flex one's iconoclastic muscles. Among the many myths that one might talk about, here are several. We have the broad overall macro myth of medieval ignorance and degradation. We have the somewhat narrower myth that condemns the medieval church and its theology for the crushing of the human spirit that led to that degradation and that eliminated all intellectual creativity from medieval life. We have a variety of narrower myths. One that is narrower in its focus but huge in its modern ubiquity is the view that medieval people thought the earth was flat, and that the reason why they thought that was certain biblical passages. I'm not going to talk about that today, except to say that we do not know of a single medieval person in the Latin-speaking part of Europe, or Latin-reading part of Europe, who did not understand that the earth was spherical. There's just zero evidence. It's an interesting topic that I'll hold a special seminar on anytime you want. So the point is we have a huge gap between public perceptions and the reality revealed by the historical record. Attempts to close that gap have so far proved futile, and it may be in the long run futile. But I try not to give up hope, and hope that you might perhaps join me in this crusade. So it's the science and religion myth that I propose to talk about today. This myth has been around for a long time. The 18th century maybe is when it first crested. The Marquis de Condorcet, who helped to create it in the 18th century, maintained, and I quote, that the triumph of Christianity in the Middle Ages was the signal for the complete decadence of philosophy and the sciences. Man's only achievements were theological daydreaming and superstitious imposture. A century later, Charles Addington Symonds, influential 19th century Renaissance historian, described the temperament of the Middle Ages as one of ignorant prostration before the idols of the church, dogma and authority and superstition. And these are pretty representative. One could come up with hundreds, indeed thousands, of similar comments. Just to prove that the myth is still alive and well, Charles Freeman, whose Closing of the Western Mind, The Rise of Faith and the Fall of Reason, published in 2003, which received a rave review in the Sunday New York Times book review section, argues that by the 5th century of the Christian era, not only has rational thought been suppressed, but there has been a substitution for it of mystery, magic, and authority. Western science would not recover, according to Freeman, until the 16th century, when Copernicus defended the heliocentric model, and various other things happened as well. Anyway, my purpose this morning is to tell it like it was. I have been working with medieval materials for 45 years, many manuscript materials, as well as published sources. First of all, a question that I think needs to be answered, and that is, was there anything during the Middle Ages that can reasonably be called science? There are many people who would say that there was not. It's a much debated question to which I happen to know the answer, which is yes. Yes, there was indeed. Many of the ingredients of what we now regard as science were certainly present. Languages for describing nature, that is a specialist terminology with meanings well understood. Methods for exploring it, including observation and experiment. If you doubt that there were experiments of the modern sort in the Middle Ages, talk to me sometime and talk about that. Factual and theoretical claims that emerged from such explorations, and finally, criteria for judging the truth or validity of these claims. Criteria that often included genuine experimentation. Moreover, it's clear that pieces of the resulting medieval knowledge were, for all practical purposes, identical to what we now take to be genuine science. Planetary astronomy, it's got the same name, and they were interested in the same problems and attacked them with many of the same methods. Geometrical optics is another one to which I've devoted much of my scholarly life. That does not mean there weren't differences. Differences in methods of investigation, to some extent, motivation, institutional support, mechanisms for the dissemination of theoretical results, and social functioning. So what there was during the Middle Ages is not identical in every respect to modern science. But despite the differences, I feel comfortable employing the expression science or natural science when talking about the Middle Ages, declaring thereby that the objects of my scholarship, though not identical to modern science, are the ancestors of modern scientific disciplines and practices, and are therefore entitled to claim the family name. So, I will be talking about science. Now, my purpose in this lecture is to discuss the relationship between this activity that I call science and that allegedly oppressive theological establishment. That's what the lecture is about. And I'd like to work backwards, beginning with the conclusions, and then attempting to convince you that they are true. 4 conclusions. Number 1, the reality of the Middle Ages in respect to these questions that I'm talking about is far too complicated to be captured by simple black and white categories such as adversaries and allies. Terms like those, black and white, they simply will not do. Second, medieval scholars, some were, and there were many medieval scholars, some were university professors, others held ecclesiastical posts, a few were situated at royal courts. These scholars all set out to understand the nature of the world in which they lived, employing all of the resources at their disposal. There's a large community. Once the universities get created, starting about 1150 for the University of Bologna, and continuing on until say the year 1500, we have somewhere between 40 and 50 medieval universities, which a conservative estimate would suggest enrolled at least 50 million people in their life. So we've got this massive educational, massive by early medieval ancient standards, being carried on during the Middle Ages. large numbers of people going through those universities. And these are the people I'm talking about. They were, as I was saying, employed all of the resources at their disposal in order to understand this world in which they lived. And that included religious tradition, inherited scientific ideas, personal observation, experimental effort, rational interference. And they did so with as much integrity as one finds in the average University of Cambridge professor. A very fine specimen indeed, I'm sure you'll agree. And with far less interference from the church than the caricature suggests. Third, this is not to deny church interference. I mean, yes, of course there was church interference, including condemnation. But serious intervention was the exception, and a fairly rare exception at that, rather than the rule. In popular mythology, the few genuine cases of interference have been inflated into a broad universal and continuous religious attack on all freedom of thought, including the natural sciences. I think that probably does capture the conception that most of you entered this room with, that this theological establishment is just out there crushing science and scientific tendencies wherever possible. In reality, the contending parties, and that's what we're talking about, contending parties, theological establishment here well, sorry, the categories aren't distinct, as it turns out. Many of the people exploring scientific ideas, well, most of them are members of the church in one form or another. But in any case, in reality, the contending parties almost always preferred peace to warfare and sought successfully in most cases to find means of compromise, accommodation, and peaceful coexistence. I think peaceful coexistence is probably the key phrase. It's not continuous conflict. Conflicts get resolved, and peaceful coexistence reigns. And finally, final conclusion, I think it is safe to say that the average medieval university professor had about as much freedom of thought and expression as did Isaac Newton in 17th century Cambridge. You could say, the university professor could say just about anything he wanted on most subjects. There are certain theological corners that he would have to be aware of, but apart from that, pretty much total freedom. Okay, that's the sort of picture I'm trying to paint, and now I'd like to do what I can to convince you that I'm not just making this up. Of course, I could be making up the evidence I'm about to give you, but I promise you I'm not doing that. How to go about a defense of this? It would be a step-by-step march through the Middle Ages would risk pedagogical disaster. That is sort of, starting early and sort of making our way century by century, important person by important person. I'm going to go to the opposite extreme, as the title of this talk suggests, in search of pedagogical success, concentrating attention on just two men. Limit ourselves, pretty much, to two men who contributed mightily to both the image and the reality of the Middle Ages. And those people are St. Augustine, 354 to 430, and the most influential theologian of the Middle Ages, without any question at all, and Roger Bacon. His dates are up there. The most notorious scientist, or most notorious person, sometimes thought to be a scientist, of the entire Middle Ages. This is compliments of the Friar Bacon pub in Oxford. Here's, there I am, back when I was doing research on Bacon. Okay.
DCL, that's you.
That's me. Yeah, yes, right. That in the younger days with more hair and we can't tell it. It's a poor picture. Yeah, that was a long time ago. Last time I was in Oxford, I went back to look at this, and they've ruined it. I mean, they still have a Roger Bacon image up there, but yeah, it's not nearly as good as this one. Whether this actually captures the true Roger Bacon, I'm not sure. I think it's probably close. Okay. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to read to you for a little bit. Augustine and his contemporaries encountered the natural sciences as elements of the classical tradition. By classical tradition, I mean the accumulated learning of Greek and Roman antiquity, passed down in a thin, derivative version. Portions of this classical tradition clashed with Christian doctrine on a variety of fundamental issues, including the nature and identity of the divine being, the problem of good and evil, the relationship between creator and creation, and the sources of religious authority. There are clashes on all of those. The early church fathers had good reason to fear the classical tradition, and many of them did. But fear was not the dominant reaction. The classical tradition offered benefits that ensured its survival and use. In the first place, repudiation of the classical tradition by the early church fathers was, as a practical matter, impossible. Many had been educated in that classical tradition before converting to Christianity and had acquired habits of thought and rational inquiry that could not have been easily tossed aside. Moreover, the tools of rational discourse and some of the assumptions of Greek philosophy were required for the development of Christian doctrine and defense of the faith against its detractors. And finally, there's the simple fact that much of the content of the classical tradition was theologically benign. It would have been absurd for educated Christians to repudiate the intellectual riches of the classical tradition in everything from botany to physics and medicine to metallurgy, thereby dooming themselves to a state of barbaric ignorance. So from the fact that Christians were wary of theological dangers in Greco-Roman philosophy and religion, it does not follow that they were prepared to renounce all aspects of Greco-Roman culture. So there's a certain amount of tension here. The worries about content, but determination somehow to assimilate and make use of this treasure that had come to them. Now, the church father who most influentially, shouldn't do that in the middle of a sentence. The church father who most influentially defined the proper attitude of medieval Christians toward pagan learning was St. Augustine. A convert to Christianity, subsequently Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, Augustine was a prolific writer on theological and philosophical topics. Many of his writings contain passages that suggest quite a cautious or even a negative attitude toward pagan learning. And this is very important. In his Confessions, Augustine warned against the dangers of curiosity. This is what he wrote: "Besides that lust of the flesh which lies in the gratification of all senses and pleasures, there pertains to the soul through the same senses of the body a certain vain and curious longing cloaked under the name of knowledge and learning." So Augustine has his serious reservations. In the same treatise, Augustine expressed regret for the effort he had devoted to mastering the liberal arts. He had a good classical education, and he expressed regret for the effort he had devoted to that, to those arts, including logic, geometry, and arithmetic. And somehow things got out of place here. effort, he wrote, that served not to my use, but rather to my destruction. That's pretty serious. Now, it is a mistake to infer from such fragments that Augustine renounced rational activity in general, or the classical tradition in particular. It is clear that he opposed false or heretical reasoning and the philosophical systems that spawned them, and he was skeptical of any large-scale investment in the classical tradition. However, rational activity, properly grounded in a life of faith and applied to appropriate objects, especially the articles of the Christian faith and their rational underpinnings, was indispensable. Here's a body of learning that is worrisome but indispensable. And the question is, what are you going to do with it? What legitimacy, then, did Augustine attach to rational activity directed toward objects having negligible or limited religious relevance? In particular, what was his attitude toward the rational and empirical investigation of the material world in which we live? And the answer is that he gave it low priority. And I think that needs to be stressed. He gave it low priority. In his literal commentary on Genesis, he noted that many scholars present long discussions of the form and shape of the heaven, matters which the sacred writers in their profound wisdom have omitted. Such subjects are of no profit for those who seek eternal happiness. And what is worse, they take up very precious time that ought to be given to what is spiritually beneficial. Augustine elaborates in his Enchiridion, which is a book of basic Christian doctrine, cautioning that we should not be alarmed if Christians are ignorant of the natural knowledge contained in the classical tradition. That is, ignorance about this stuff is okay. It is sufficient, he says, for them to understand that God is the only cause of created things. In another book, On Christian Doctrine, which was just extraordinarily influential in the Middle Ages, throughout the Middle Ages, long after Augustine's death, in On Christian Doctrine, he argued that the classical tradition contains very little that is genuinely useful. And he proposed the compilation of handbooks to provide Christians with all they need to know of each discipline. Quoting him here, explanations of whatever unfamiliar geographical locations, animals, herbs and trees, stones and metals are mentioned in the scripture. The same thing could be done with numbers, he says. So, a little handbook that gives us everything we need to know to understand difficult passages in scripture. The natural philosophy of the classical tradition, it appears, had only very modest religious utility. But it turns out that in Augustine's view, modest religious utility was no cause for repudiation. In his literal commentary on Genesis, Augustine, for one thing, changes his mind and his mood. And he has, he wrote voluminously. In his literal commentary on Genesis, Augustine made clear that although scriptural knowledge is, let me say this slowly, scriptural knowledge is vastly superior to sensory knowledge. Sensory knowledge is inestimably superior to ignorance. Moreover, he worried that Christians naively interpreting Scripture might express absurd opinions on cosmological issues, thus provoking ridicule among better informed pagans and bringing the Christian faith into disrepute. And here's what he says, what he writes. Even non-Christians know something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of the world, about the motion and orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions, about the predictable eclipses of the sun and moon, the cycles of the years and the seasons, about the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for a non-believer to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. Very different, St. Augustine here, than in some of the passages that I quoted earlier. So there were contexts in which Augustine's attitude toward pagan works on natural philosophy was favorable. In On Christian Doctrine, that treatise, again, he argued that if the philosophers, especially the Platonists, have said true things, as Augustine believed they had, these truths should not be feared but should be appropriated by Christians. A Christian, he concluded, should understand that wherever he may find truth, it is his Lord's. That is, all genuine truth is God's truth. A very powerful and fundamental view in Augustine. So in Augustine's view, then, natural knowledge was not to be loved, but to be used. The next quotation states this clearly. Let's see. I'm sorry if that's. Let me see if that's what I. Doesn't look. Just take a break here and stand up and stretch or something. This is not. I got ahead of myself there. Here, quoting him, we should use this world and not enjoy it, so that by means of corporeal and temporal things we may comprehend the eternal and the spiritual. I hope you get, when he says not enjoy it, he means one doesn't invest oneself in a pursuit of this. Natural philosophy, so the point then is that the material and temporal must serve the spiritual and eternal. Natural philosophy, pagan in origin, is legitimized, indeed sanctified, by the service it performs for the faith. The natural sciences are to be the handmaidens of science, of theology and religion. And that is it's a powerful theme. I mean, this is the handmaiden tradition at work. So, did Augustine practice what he preached? I mean, this so far has just been preaching at us. Did he, in fact, put the natural sciences to work on behalf of theology and religion? Although such a project was not at the top of his agenda, whenever the natural sciences impinged on or could be mobilized in support of his episcopal, pastoral, or theological responsibilities, Augustine put them to work. There's no clearer example than his literal commentary on Genesis, where he made copious use of the natural sciences contained in the classical tradition to explicate the creation story as found in the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis and other biblical passages that address or appear to address scientific questions. Here we encounter quite a long list, so bear with me here. In Augustine's literal commentary on Genesis, we encounter Greco-Roman ideas about lightning, thunder, clouds, wind, rain, dew, snow, frost, storms, tides, plants and animals, matter and form, the 4 elements, the doctrine of natural place, seasons, time, the calendar, the planets, planetary motion, the phases of the moon, astrological influence, the soul, sensation, sound, light and shade, number theory, and more. The point is that for all of his worry about overvaluing the natural philosophy of the classical tradition, Augustine applied it with a vengeance to biblical interpretation. That was his practice. So, to conclude on Augustine, what are we to make of his involvement in the classical natural sciences? 3 points that are worth making. Each one is on a slide. First, it's important to appreciate Augustine's deep ambivalence toward the natural sciences. I have no desire for people to forget that. They are not directly related to salvation or the Christian's terrestrial pilgrimage, and therefore they are of secondary or tertiary importance. Augustine was no champion of the natural sciences. Nonetheless, he believed that they are indispensable for scriptural interpretation and defense of the faith. They play a handmaiden role. Second conclusion. Despite his ambivalence, it was Augustine who most influentially articulated the handmaiden formula as a rationale for pursuing the natural sciences, a rationale that would govern attitudes toward the natural sciences to the end of the Middle Ages and beyond. Though of no intrinsic value, the natural sciences of the classical tradition acquired value extrinsically insofar as they proved useful handmaidens of theology and the church, as Augustine clearly believed they did. And third conclusion, these are the things I'd like you to take away from the Augustine part of this lecture. Thirdly, Augustine put the natural sciences to work in his role as pastor, theologian, and biblical interpreter, demonstrating by example what the handmaiden formula prescribed in words. So, are you with me so far? Too fast? Too slow?
What is the handmaiden formula?
The handmaiden formula is simply that the natural sciences are meant to serve the faith, the church, the Christian community. Handmaiden is simply servant. It comes from the Latin word ancilla, which happens to be feminine noun, and therefore we talk about the handmaiden rather than the male servant of religion. Well, okay. What happens between Augustine and Bacon? Those are my two guys, right? Radical changes occurred in the 800 years between Augustine's death and Roger Bacon's birth. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Europe experienced extraordinary political, social, and economic revival. All of that is true. It surprises people to learn that that kind of thing happened during the Middle Ages, but it certainly did. A population explosion led to re-urbanization and economic development, which in turn created opportunities for educated people. Schools multiplied in number and size. Universities emerged, offering advanced liberal and professional education. And perhaps most important of all, translations of Greek and Arabic sources provided educated Europeans with a vastly larger, more complete version of the classical tradition, including the major scientific achievements of Greek antiquity with Islamic additions and improvements. And that short paragraph takes care of 800 years and brings us to my boy, Roger Bacon. The point is that of the translations, the Augustine and his contemporaries had access to a thin version of the classical, tradition of Greek and Roman learning. Just, so much of it was lost in the West, but it survived in Islam. And the translations of the 12th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries from Arabic to Latin brought the whole thing, the thick version, into Western Europe, where it produced extraordinary, an explosion of knowledge and access really to the whole of the Greek tradition. So this brings us to Roger Bacon, who grew up in this new world. Bacon was born into this new world, into a prosperous English family. Bacon, by the way, I know he's associated with Oxford, and you at Cambridge are going to probably would like him to be denigrated, but anyway, he was born into a prosperous English family sometime between 1214 and 1220. We know nothing of his youth and early schooling, but he obtained his university education at the universities of Oxford and Paris. Subsequently, he taught at the University of Paris, which was the premier university in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. He taught at the University of Paris, lecturing on the scientific works of Aristotle in the 1240s, one of the first professors to do so. At some point, he expanded his scope to include mathematical and what he called experimental science, for which he's become famous. I mean, he talks about experimental science. He has a big section of one of his books, so labeled. And he joined the Franciscan order, one of a pair of mendicant orders that existed at the time. Bacon's fame rests on a trio of treatises written at the Pope's request, in which he laid out an ambitious plan for the reform of learning in Christendom based on knowledge of the natural sciences contained in the newly translated works of the classical tradition. I guess I could have said that simpler, that paragraph, giving you that content in simpler form. Bacon is one of the first Western Europeans to really master the whole of that translated classical tradition. One of the first. He's not, I mean, who knows who the first one was, but long, while other people were, still trying to deal with pieces of it, Roger Bacon sat down and mastered the whole thing. And his scientific contributions were primarily simply making available Greek and Islamic knowledge to people in the West. Now, the campaign on which Bacon thus embarked was both ambitious and delicate. He was attempting to steer a middle course between two equally unacceptable alternatives. On the one hand, the newly available materials presented themselves as an autonomous body of secularized knowledge. So this is secular learning that you get in this classical tradition. This is not Christian, this is pagan in origin. Had no religious function, and apparently it was prepared to serve no master but human rational capacities. In short, it was an expression of precisely the vain curiosity that Augustine had warned against. On the other hand, Bacon feared that those who wielded power within Christendom would overreact to the dangers of the new learning and repudiate an inestimable treasure. Now that's, in broad outline, the same problem that we have already seen in the patristic period. How to deal with an intellectual heritage that was simultaneously dangerous, theologically, but also indispensable, intellectually. How to salvage it and put it to work without condoning its intolerable theological consequences. How to discipline it without emasculating it. Theologians of the patristic and early medieval periods had developed working arrangements that made it possible to live with and indeed gain the benefits of the classical tradition. You've seen that in St. Augustine. Now, in Bacon's day, the problem returned, but under changed circumstances. The theological dangers of the classical tradition in the fuller version available in the 13th century were both more numerous and more intractable. So the theological problems are much more serious. Where am I here? While the utility of this version of the classical tradition was also a great deal more obvious. So more dangerous, but a whole lot more valuable as well. And the problem is, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to make your peace with this? What exactly were the theological dangers? A number of specific Aristotelian claims trampled on critically important Christian doctrines. Aristotle's description of an eternal universe having neither beginning nor end was radically opposed to the Christian doctrines of creation and final judgment. The universe described by Aristotle was deterministic, governed by causal chains rigidly determined by the natures of things. No room for miracles in that world. This determinism, combined with Aristotle's description of a deity who never intervened in the operation of the cosmos, undermined the Christian doctrines of divine omnipotence, providence, and miracles. And Aristotle's theory of the soul, as generally understood, left no room for personal immortality. So we got problems, this thick version of the classical tradition. But the overriding menace may have been the rationalistic outlook in which Aristotle's philosophy came packaged. A mastery of the Aristotelian works made available through the translations left no doubt that the only road to truth was Aristotelian demonstration based on sense experience and rational inference. The new learning contained in this relatively complete version of the classical tradition thus entered Christian Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries under the banner of extreme rationalism. If one closely observed the more radical defenders of the new learning, they're variations, certainly, in reactions to it. As for the more radical defenders of the new learning, it might appear that even theological doctrines would be compelled to pass the test of syllogistic demonstration. Human reason seemed poised to shove biblical revelation aside and become the sole arbiter of truth. Now, we might expect, given the circumstances and the myths that we all know, that the religious authorities would move with single-minded zeal to suppress this menace, this new learning. And a very durable myth maintains that they did just that. The truth, however, is otherwise. In fact, the response was quite mixed. The teaching of Aristotle's works on the natural sciences was forbidden in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris in 1210 and 1215. But the ban did not extend beyond the borders of Paris. And before the end of the century, the Bishop of Paris would issue a condemnation of a long list of propositions drawn from Aristotelian natural philosophy and other works in the classical tradition. So there is a theological attack, a theological condemnation. But the new learning also had its defenders, scholars, including churchmen, who recognized its overwhelming explanatory power in every area of human knowledge. Aristotle's natural philosophy offered a convincing framework and a powerful methodology for thinking about cosmology, meteorology, matter theory, motion, light, sensation, psychology, that is the theory of the soul, and biological phenomena of all kinds. The mathematical astronomy of Ptolemy and the tradition it spawned were able to predict planetary positions with extraordinary accuracy. The geometrical optics of Euclid, Ptolemy, and their Islamic followers dealt successfully with the reflection and refraction of light and the principal phenomena of visual perception. And medical treatises offered anatomical and physiological knowledge along with descriptions of diseases and therapies for curing or preventing them. For educated people in general, but especially for professors and students in the medieval universities, the new learning was simply too attractive and too persuasive to surrender. This is just too valuable. It transforms European intellectual life, and the intellectuals are not prepared to give it up. We do not know exactly when or how Bacon became involved in struggles over the new learning. In the 1240s, he was lecturing on Aristotle at the University of Paris. In the 1250s, he entered the Franciscan order, where he found time to write on mathematical and what he called experimental science. And in the 1260s, he was fully engaged in defense of the natural sciences and other portions of the new learning. He understood the precarious position of the natural sciences, made obvious by the banning of Aristotle's books on nature at Paris back in 1210 and 1215. His aim was to head off any further threat, either from the religious authorities, who had the power to cut off access to the new learning, or from champions of the new learning prepared to carry its radical rationalistic program to the point of compromising Christian doctrine. So we've got two worries. On the one hand, the church here could condemn the whole works. On the other hand, these more radical Aristotelians may be pushing, the most extreme interpretation of Aristotle's works. His goal was to demonstrate that the pagan learning of the classical tradition was a vital resource capable of offering essential services to theology and the church, and moreover, that it posed no insurmountable religious threat. That suitably disciplined, and he was one who would be prepared to start disciplining it, suitably disciplined and purged of error, this classical tradition would serve as the faithful handmaiden of religion and the church. This was Augustine's handmaiden formula, re-articulated at a moment in history when there was a great deal more learning, some of it potentially unruly, to be brought into servitude to religion. Bacon's campaign on behalf of the new learning found its fully and most systematic expression in his Opus Maius, it just simply says the great work, written in the 1260s at the request of Pope Clement IV. The central theme of this book, drawn from Augustine's On Christian Doctrine. Isn't that interesting? I mean, here's Bacon drawing on that important work. I'm probably not the only person who ever read On Christian Doctrine, Augustine's On Christian Doctrine, and Bacon's Opus Maius consecutively, but I did. I was not quite knowing what I was getting into, but it was a research project I had undertaken, and so I read Augustine's On Christian Doctrine, and then I started Bacon, and gee, this looked familiar. I mean, Bacon is an Augustinian, this supposedly radical scientist of the 13th century. The central theme of the book, of Bacon's book, drawn from Augustine's On Christian Doctrine, is that there exists one perfect, all-encompassing wisdom, the ultimate source of which is Scripture. Philosophy is not an autonomous intellectual enterprise, but properly practiced the unfolding and expounding of scriptural truth. Bacon goes so far as to maintain that for something to be against Scripture, it is sufficient for that something merely to be independent of Scripture. Simply to be independent. I mean, that's a startling statement. If it's independent of Scripture, that's enough. It's thereby against Scripture. His own words, whatever is not connected to Scripture is proved to be against it and is to be abhorred by Christians. Now, that's a very narrow criterion of legitimacy. So narrow, it would appear as to exclude major portions of the classical tradition. However, Bacon is an ingenious guy, and he proceeds to claim that almost everything passes that test. He reminds his readers of those passages in which Augustine claims that all truth, wherever it is found, is God's truth. And on that basis, he admonishes his reader to snatch philosophical truths from pagans, from the pagan classical tradition, as from unlawful possessors. If all truth is God's truth, then philosophical truths, whatever their origin, wherever they may be found, are automatically Christian truths. And the entire world of learning, insofar as it achieves truth, also achieves legitimacy within a Christian context. Bacon's quite explicit about this, claiming that philosophy as a whole is worthy and belongs to sacred truth. Those are his words. But to give his argument credibility, Bacon must elaborate on the benefits for Christendom of the various philosophical and scientific disciplines. And I have a feeling you're probably saying, oh no, I've had enough, not more. So I'm going to skip a little bit. What Bacon does, he devotes hundreds of pages to demonstrating the theological utility, or the utility for the Christian commonwealth, of the natural sciences of the classical tradition. And it's a very interesting project. You can read my, Oxford University Press has published a very nice volume that I'm sure you want to own. Costs only $125, I think. It includes my edition, critical edition, and English translation of a lot of that stuff. But anyway, no, you don't really want to buy it. Don't do it. Let's see. Oh, this brings me to conclusions. I'd like to be sure that you understand the purpose of this lecture. It has not been my aim to praise Augustine or Bacon for great scientific accomplishments, or for the anticipation of any aspect of modern science. There are some anticipations, but that's not my point. It's not my aim. Augustine lived near the end of the patristic period, Bacon during the High Middle Ages, and it should surprise nobody to learn that their conceptions of nature were representative of the eras and cultures to which they belonged. Each was a significant factor in the intellectual life of his age, helping to determine attitudes toward the classical scientific tradition. Each had a continuing influence that extended well beyond his lifetime. So this essay does not aim to measure Augustine and Bacon by modern scientific or religious yardsticks. And that's a rule, by the way. I mean, today is History Day. It appears in the schedule, and that is one of the important canons of the historical enterprise. We are not judging these historical figures, by modern standards. We're looking at them in context. So this essay does not aim to measure Augustine and Bacon by modern scientific or religious yardsticks, but merely to explore the ways in which the scientific beliefs and attitudes, patristic or medieval in character, of these two influential men interacted with the Christian context in which they lived. It has to be done in context. What may be the most surprising conclusion is the close resemblance between the two. Bacon, celebrated for his alleged repudiation of authority and anticipation of modern scientific methodology, was in fact a faithful follower of St. Augustine in his attitude toward the natural sciences. Augustine had no use for the natural sciences as ends in themselves, but he accepted them and even esteemed them as valuable, if sometimes problematic, handmaidens. Roger Bacon shared those opinions. He feared that the problematic aspects of the classical tradition would lead to its repudiation by medieval Christendom, an eventuality that he was determined to head off. His Opus Maius is an extended plea for the reliability and religious utility of the handmaiden named natural science. It does not follow, of course, that there were no significant differences between Augustine and Bacon. Most obviously, Augustine was a theologian, more worried about the threat to theology posed by the natural sciences than the threat to the natural sciences posed by theology. Whereas in Bacon's hierarchy of worries, the order appears to have been inverted. Moreover, Bacon lived at a moment in history when a far more complete version of the classical tradition was available than in Augustine's day, poised, depending on your point of view, either to threaten the faith or to serve it. Whereas Augustine thought small pieces of the classical tradition would prove religiously useful, Bacon believed that almost everything could be of service. Bacon proceeded to demonstrate how the handmaiden formula could be stretched to justify a remarkable array of natural sciences, some of which seemed at first glance to have little or no utility for theology or religion. And let me see if I can cut this a little bit more out of this conclusion. How did the natural sciences fare as handmaidens? That would be a very legitimate question. I mean, does that corrupt them in some fashion? The answer depends, of course, on time, place, local circumstance, and the specific scientific claims in question. The short answer, which we can explore in discussion if you like, is that technical disciplines such as the mathematical sciences fared quite well as handmaidens. They were theologically neutral, with hardly any exceptions, and their theoretical content was not affected by religious or theological considerations. Optics, the science that Bacon knew best, and the one on which he wrote most voluminously, and the one that I've studied for about 40 years, is a good example. In his grand synthesis of Greek and Islamic theories of light and vision, that's what Bacon gives us, nobody has identified a single theoretical claim, the content of which was influenced by Bacon's goal of endowing optics with handmaiden status, or his membership in a Christian culture. It was simply, it was as devoid of theological content as the Greek and Islamic sources that were at his disposal. In disciplines that impinged on broader issues of causation or worldview, on the other hand, handmaiden status clearly made a difference. Aristotelian natural philosophy raised a variety of theological problems that had to be dealt with, and the solution was often rejection or revision of Aristotelian doctrine. Cosmogony and cosmology were shaped by various portions of the biblical text, Genesis story, for example. What we see during the Middle Ages, then, is a complicated interplay between scientific and religious beliefs. I hope I've at least gotten that across. A complicated interplay. University professors and other university-educated Europeans placed high value on both the Christian and classical traditions. They were committed to the central doctrines of Christian theology. They accepted the authority of the church to determine what these doctrines were. They also recognized the extraordinary explanatory power of the classical natural sciences, and many hitched their reputations and their careers to the further development and dissemination of those sciences. It should come as no surprise that when such people discovered areas of conflict between the religious and the scientific traditions, they looked for ways of making peace. Compromise, clarification, reinterpretation, revision, the identification of outright error, all played a part in the achievement of peace. None of this occurred without a struggle, of course, and a certain amount of skirmishing has continued from then until now. But by the end of the Middle Ages, the classical sciences had accommodated themselves to Christian doctrine and the needs of Christian culture, while Christian theology had taken its form, its method, and some of its content from the classical tradition. The classical sciences had entered the mainstream of Christian culture, a position from which they have never been dislodged. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much, David, for getting us launched into this History Day. And it's now open to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You can decide whether the question I'm about to ask is sufficiently on topic or not. I think it's clear that the handmaiden view is not what we presently see operating. Would you want, in the last few centuries,
Right.
If you had to hazard a guess, would you suggest that it was the result of scientific knowledge that we acquired, or social and political factors, or what that caused that view to go away? Or is that just not relevant to your talk? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. And by the way, the only questions allowed are questions that you know ahead of time I would know the answer to. And this is one of them. I mean, the handmaiden role of natural sciences continues beyond the Middle Ages. I mean, you find plenty of 17th century scientists talking about, the purpose of their work is to glorify the creators. That continues to some extent into the 19th century. It gradually is transformed, and if anything, the power relationship it becomes inverted, and theology becomes the handmaiden of science. And what I mean now, I don't know how many people there are here who count themselves as theologians interested in science and theology. And I'm supposed to be close to this? Oh, sorry, I'm used to moving around. But insofar as I've encountered theologians lecturing on the subject of science and religion, there's been a great rush by the theological community to accommodate its theology to what the natural sciences, Big Bang and all the rest. I can't really identify the forces. This has been a very gradual transition of having to do with secularization, surely in part, growing confidence in the conclusions reached by the natural sciences. Does that make a dent, at least in your...
I knew it would be a long, complicated story. So.
Okay.
Yes, that's
When you say paganism, what do you really mean? When you say paganism...
Paganism. Yeah, I should explain that term.
Let me say a few words before why I ask this question.
Sure.
Paganism, or the synonymous word, doesn't exist in our tradition or culture or language.
Yeah.
And my question is that when you say classic tradition and the Christian tradition, it kind of that contrasting each other.
Yes.
And why is it the case that the garden view of the reality, that both the flowers are part of the reality, didn't emerge, rather the image emerged that it is in contrast or kind of hierarchy, or in terms of kind of not friendly relationship, or that kind of image of reality emerged in the Christian worldview.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not certain that I understood all of your
First
question,
of
but
all,
let
on the
me.
definition of paganism. What do you mean when you talk about pagan?
Yeah, one has to be careful with that term, and perhaps I wasn't cautious enough. But it's simply, it's used. It's a medieval term, which is why I have used it, and it simply means non-Christian. Anything non-Christian is pagan. If the Islam is paganism to medieval Christian Europeans. But I think you were asking me why there had to be tension between.
So Judaism is paganism too?
Pardon?
Yes.
Judaism is also paganism?
That's a good question. Whether medieval people thought, if you're asking for my opinion, I mean, I assume you're not asking for my opinion. Of course, it's not paganism. It's a good question that I've never thought about. I don't know. I don't think it is usually applied by medieval figures to the Jewish tradition. But Ernan, you know everything. You should.
Is that
I mean, actually, the second part of the question is that in Hindu world there are 6 philosophical systems, and there are 6 philosophical systems. All are very distinct, unique, but the relationship is of non-antagonistic contradiction. So much so one can be perfect atheist and still a Hindu, because it's a valid point of view of the world.
Yes.
Now when you say classic tradition, Christian God, pagan God, Greek God, it's kind of not the view of the reality as a whole, rather than piecemeal approach to the reality. My question is why it emerged that way, because the tension between the worlds, religion, secular or atheist or believers, probably emerged from that way, that
Yes, you're asking a causal question, and I think the only answer I can give you is that historians can describe infinitely more historical events than they can explain. I mean, and so description is what we very often fall back on, and I think that's the case here.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question over here, I think. Yes. Oh, so there's one over here. Just that's right. Yeah.
It seems to me that a problem that with development of later science was not so much that science couldn't be a handmaiden to theology, but that it became too good a handmaiden. Would you agree? It was Aristotelianism became the problem for science a bit later on. Or does that impinge too much on your
I don't think I would. I don't agree with that. The Aristotelian tradition lives on into the 17th century, and it has a very complicated relationship to the origins of modern science. And my good friend Peter Harrison this afternoon is going to, I trust, enlighten us on such matters. The creators of the scientific revolution had to come to terms with Aristotelian thought, and it's an extremely complicated relationship. It's not sort of a matter of suddenly getting rid of everything Aristotelian. Have I addressed your question?
Yes, I look forward to hearing the story.
Okay. Peter Harrison knows all things about that subject.
Either or, just keep it to that. Okay. Mustafa at the back. Yeah.
Well, thanks for your presentation. It was very helpful. I wonder how St. Augustine replied to the Aristotelian idea of a eternal universe. It was discussed in the Islamic world, and some people tried to make a coexistence with that, with the idea of a creation, whereas Al-Ghazali said no, it's created ex nihilo.
Right.
And I wonder how St. Augustine, maybe you explained it. I'm sorry, maybe I missed
Well,
it.
no, I didn't explain it.
Okay,
I mean, he simply. It is scriptural. I mean, he has a scriptural source. If there is a moment of creation, and Augustine accepts that without question. Well, I don't know enough about his transition from non-Christian to Christian position on the subject, but it's just not a matter that is open to dispute as far as Augustine is concerned.
So didn't he use independent reasoning or logic to demonstrate the truth of?
He's prepared to do so.
He's prepared to do so.
But the eternity of the universe, you can't. There is no demonstration of that. You have a biblical text that asserts it.
Okay.
But Augustine certainly uses his rational powers.
Skills, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, so a couple of questions down this direction. So we'll go to this row first. Yeah. And then up to Lydia. So stand here.
Thanks.
Write something about Augustine.
In a second, I will just take this question. Yes. So, yeah.
You said that there was no doubt that the only road to truth was based on sensory experience and investigation, and that was really the premise.
Say that again.
That there's no doubt that the only road to truth was based on sensory experience and investigation, and that was the extreme rationalism that you were talking about. I was wondering whether this was one of the points at which philosophy began to diverge from theology and natural sciences as a valid method in itself.
Philosophy.
Use the mic over there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you're pushing me into waters that I've not navigated very much. You have you have the two major and most important philosophical systems are the Aristotelian and Platonic systems. Theology is a part of those. I mean, each has a theology. With the coming of Christianity, you have a biblical source out of which quite a different sort of theology is created. And so you have Christian theology clashing in various ways with Platonic theology, and Aristotle's much less elaborated theology.
Do you want to come back on that?
Well, it just seems to me that from what you've been describing, as though the movement has gone more towards empirical investigation rather than the process of speculative thinking based on rational logical conclusions, which is more the method of philosophy, and whether this kind of emphasis actually began to get lost sight of, and the rush, as you were saying, then became all towards scientific.
Yeah, I think we would need to talk about specific philosophical issues.
Yeah.
As a general question, I don't have an
Yeah.
answer for it.
Okay, we'll come forward to Lydia, and then go.
Yeah, just two questions of clarification. Did I get it right that you said that 50 million people were trained in European medieval universities? Well, this
Yeah,
the correct
when
figure
I-
just seems
yeah,
huge.
Right, it is, and I was trying. At the time, I said to myself, yeah, sorry, I'll be back here. I go to that 500,000. I think is the term that I wanted.
Which is still a huge number.
Yeah,
but-
yeah.
So let's get the figure straight. 500,000.
500,000
That's a major number.
is
Just repeat that.
a min-
I want to get it straight.
minimum
Yeah.
estimate of the number that matriculated in medieval universities, and many that matriculated did not finish. In fact, a minority finished. But a minimum of 50 million people matriculated in the medieval universities in which the centerpiece of the curriculum was Aristotelian natural philosophy. So that those who went, who finished, earned a degree, or at least stayed at the university for some length of time, came out of there educated in the Aristotelian tradition. So, for example, that is how one can claim that every educated person knew that the Earth was spherical and knew its approximate circumference and so forth. Not looking at the wrong person.
What period is that?
Can you give us
Over
the
what
period?
period? Because you just said 50 million again.
500, I think.
You mean?
I said 50 million
Yeah, you
again?
did just
Oh,
then.
sorry, 500,000.
500,000
over
what
what
period?
Over 500 years.
From the beginning of the universities, first founding, University of Bologna, about 1150 to the year 1500.
Okay, so 450 years.
Yeah, I get that estimate from Professor William Courtney, a good friend of mine who is an authority on medieval university education. He thinks it could be far more than that, but he would think that's minimum.
It's worth remembering that in universities like here in Cambridge, many students died before they graduated, because that's what you know,
do.
and still do, but not so many. Okay, Lydia, you have one more question.
Yeah, just a second question of clarification. I was astonished to see astrological influence cited by Augustine. I always thought that Augustine had argued against astrology, so his argument is based on twins. So, but he would still take in some of the the classical astrology in his argument on ritual commentary on
He
Genesis.
certainly attacks astrology. I don't remember how I brought it in to the...
You said that in his literary commentary on Genesis, he would rely on astrology, or astrological influence.
It was in your list. You gave a great list
Yeah.
here of things that he referred to. I thought astrology was one of them.
The terms were interchangeable during the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
for one
Okay.
thing. But Ernan, you looked as though you were...
Well,
Can you take the mic there, because it's otherwise it'll get picked up. Thanks. Yeah.
He had as you say, Dave, the term astrology at the time was used ambiguously. It was used both for what we would call astrology, what we would call astronomy, but he himself made a very, very, as you pointed out, a very strong distinction between the two, and the reason was that astrology, from his point of view, threatened the Christian doctrine of free will.
Right.
And he was extremely opposed to astrology. He has a lovely story to show the weakness of astrology. You probably know the story where in a wealthy person's house, a servant in the house and the lady of the house are both having children.
Right.
And the children are born at the same time, and the reason that they know that is that the servants were sent from each room to the other room and they met halfway, so they were born at the same time. But what dictated the future was that one was born of the lady of the house and the other was born of a servant. The point simply being that astrology was of no value and threatened, as I say, whereas astronomy, as you pointed out, for him was an investigation of nature, and nature was God's handiwork. And so astronomy was in fact a furtherance of God's work, in a sense. It was a further understanding of God's work, so that astronomy was quite the opposite of astrology. It was in fact a participation in the work of God.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Now, Colin had a question, and then we'll sort of go to that side again. So, yeah.
Could you say a little more about the ideas and information that came from the Islamic world? When did it happen, and what particular information came? Was it Greek texts? And where did it go to? Was it the University of Paris? Or?
Okay,
So,
yeah.
Did you hear the question over there? Did you hear the question? You can hear? Okay, okay, sorry.
The Islamic contribution. I could talk for a long time about it. I've been, a book of mine, The Beginnings of Western Science, has a chapter on Islamic science, and I've just been revising it for a second. Pardon? Speak more slowly? Yes. Thanks. And I've just spent a month immersed in the sources on Islamic history. I don't read Arabic and I don't do original research, but I read the research stuff. And I have become, in the first edition of this book, I talk a lot about the Islamic, the trouble fitting Islamic science into Islamic culture. I come out of this more recent effort with a great deal more admiration for Islamic science than I ever had before. It was an extraordinary achievement. The Islam inherits the Greek tradition pretty much in toto. I mean, it's an interesting story, the eastward migration of Greek knowledge. But in any case, it reaches Islam. Islam does not have any formal educational system. So acquiring a philosophical education is very much a matter of just enterprise. We have biographies of people who, they talk about getting a tutor, and I mean, you get a tutor or you read the original sources. And out of this came extraordinary achievements in the mathematical sciences especially, medicine, and the medical sciences in addition. And there seems to be very little friction. There's minimal friction. It's there. There's no question that there are some theological problems. I mean, Islam has its own theology, but there were enclaves of liberalism. Well, in first place, the mathematical sciences aren't going to be a theological problem anyway, but at the major courts, you have enclaves of free thought and simply remarkable achievements, which are then passed on with the translations. The translations really get going when Christian armies conquer Spain, which had been conquered earlier by Islam, and Islamic learning had been transmitted to Spain, primarily by means of Spain. So you have Christian philosophers, scholars heading for Spain, learning Arabic, finding Arabic treatises on important subjects and translating them. It's a massive translation enterprise, and it brings almost the entire thick tradition of the thick version of the classical tradition to European university centers, and revolutionizes learning. No, the translation begins very late in the 11th century. Gets going in the 11th, in the 12th. I mean, that 12th is the big century for translation. Continues in the 13th. Tapers off in the 14th.
So there's your translations from
the microphone.
From Arabic to European languages.
What is translated? We have the translation to Latin of works that had previously been translated into Arabic, and we have the translation into Latin of newly authored works in Arabic. And Bacon's role, his important contribution, is to have mastered a very large portion of that heritage, especially the mathematical science part.
Thank you.
Just an extra point on that. The heyday of Islamic science was over before anything began really in the West. The heyday was probably the 10th, 11th century, maybe into the 12th. But I think it's interesting here that almost exactly the same kind of tensions occurred in Islam as you mentioned for the Christian tradition. Because on the one hand, you had somebody like Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who was a strong adherent of Aristotle, and because of that, raised the same issues, exactly the same issues about determinism, for example, that came up later in the West. And so Averroes became an extremely controversial figure in Islam and was opposed by people like Al-Ghazali, for example, who took a strongly theological position against him. So I think it's quite striking, in a sense, to see the same kind of tensions, particularly around the Aristotelian tradition, between a rather fundamentalist approach to the Quran on the one hand, and an extremely almost secular approach on the part of somebody like Averroes, with people like Avicenna, for example, somewhere in the middle. But I think I think is quite striking is to see the parallel between the two traditions from the point of view of your theme of religion and science. The science is dominant in Averroes. The science is opposed, or at least criticized in Al-Ghazali, and Avicenna as a great scientist in the middle who tried to balance the two.
Thank you very much. Rodney's been waiting a long time over there on the other side, so if we can get the mic over that side.
It's really just a clarification with regard to the questions about Islam, actually, and this idea of the universe being created and so on. My understanding is that Augustine said that time was created, the universe had an origin.
Yes.
And similarly, in the medieval period, Aquinas said that the universe had an origin. I mean, theoretically, it could have been eternal. But it was a revealed truth that there was an origin, and therefore that would be something that would be shared between the Christians and
Yes.
and the Islamic
Yes.
world.
Yes, exactly.
As a second point, I wanted to raise something else. I mean, it's interesting in theology, certainly, that in the medieval period you have the method of disputation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite clear if you read Aquinas about sort of question and objection
Right.
and answer and so
Right.
on, and how the universities worked. And I was wondering if that really, if science worked in that way in that period, whether they had
Disputation.
Yeah.
Yes. 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 I mean, one can certainly find medieval examples of observation and experimentation designed to test an hypothesis. But most of the scientific work that you'd call scientific was a matter of lectures and disputation. A lot of it focused on the Aristotelian text, but other texts as well, on reading the text and dissecting it. And I mean, you have medieval logicians who were powerful thinkers. I don't know if they make logicians anymore like the way they made them in the 13th century. So it's a matter of finding consistencies between Aristotle, within the Aristotelian corpus, or between the Aristotelian corpus and other pieces of knowledge.
It's a very interesting way of arriving at truth. I mean, it does mean that there are opposing positions.
Yes.
And,
I mean, in the course of that, of course, the people who are arguing talk about observations that they make. I mean, Nicolas Rame in the 14th century, a very important character, is dealing with motion. This is disputation he's involved in, but he also talks about observations that one makes that are germane to the discussion.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Anyone else? Yes, there's one in the back here, yes, before we break the coffee. It's over here. Yes.
It's been a very interesting talk, and I think it's interesting to see the parallels you drew between Augustine and Bacon, and also then the examples of similar sort of situation in Islam as well. And I was thinking, well, it's very similar, it seems, today as well. I mean, the sort of, you've got the rationalists who would do away with all sorts of almost sort of emotional thought and spiritual thought, and then you've got the church who are very keen to hold on to those, perhaps at the expense of doing away with some scientific ideas. And one statement you made was not to judge Augustine and Bacon by today's standards. And I wondered what sense you meant that, and whether perhaps we could sort of to look back at them as examples and judge them by today's standards.
Well, by all means, look back to them as examples. But what I simply meant is that I'm, we should not look to Augustine as we should not judge him by contemporary standards in his attitudes toward the natural sciences, for example, or towards anything else. He was fully a man of the patristic period, and both his theology and his attitude toward the natural sciences are those of the culture to which he belonged. And the culture to which he contributed. I mean, one makes contributions as well as draws from.
Historians like to describe history and let the listener interpret it in their own way for their own period. Is that generally the positioning, isn't it? That,
yeah, I mean, historians describe, but they explain when they can. What historians of science have to be very careful not to do is look for precursors. That Bacon is a precursor of modern science. That leads to inflation of Bacon's achievement, misinterpretation of it, trying to make it look modern. And early history of science, I mean, earlier in this century, that's sort of what history of science was. And no respectable historian of science now plays that game of precursoritis.
Good. Well, that's a good note, I think, on which to close for coffee break. Let's just thank David very much for a great session.